The air over San Antonio's west side hung heavy that dawn, thick, gray, and bitter with the chill of a storm that refused to move on. In apartment 3B, the only light came from a flickering bulb and a small kitchen lamp that hummed louder than it should have. There, a 73-year-old woman named Ellie Martinez sat motionless at her table, surrounded by mountains of unopened envelopes. Red, yellow, white, each stamped with the same merciless phrase, "Final notice." The camera would move slowly across the table, past the chipped mug of cold coffee, past the thimble and scattered threads, to rest on one letter marked Notice of Eviction. The due amount, $50,000. For someone who had spent a lifetime sewing other people's dreams, wedding gowns, communion dresses, quinceañera gowns, that number might as well have been 50 million. Outside, the first city buses rattled by. Inside, Ellie's trembling fingers traced the ink like a prayer she no longer believed in. Her hands were rough, scarred from decades of guiding fabric under the hum of her old singer machine, but now they only trembled. The landlord's letter had given her 30 days to pay or leave, 30 days to find a miracle. The voice of her late husband still echoed in her head. Arthur, the man who had once told her, "Don't worry, me amor, hard work always pays off." But hard work hadn't paid the hospital bills. It hadn't stopped the cancer. It hadn't stopped the debt collectors who called from sunrise to sundown. Through the thin apartment walls, a radio played an upbeat morning jingle. The contrast was cruel. The world outside was moving on, oblivious to the old seamstress inside counting her last coins, wondering which utility she could let go next. Light or water. Her neighbors barely knew her name. To them, she was just the old lady with the sewing machine, another forgotten soul on Culebra Road. But once, decades ago, she'd been famous in her block. Ellie's Stitches, her shop, had been the pride of the community. Brides swore her gowns carried good luck. Mothers brought their daughters to her for dresses that made them feel seen, beautiful, unstoppable. Now the shop was gone. The machine sold. The sign, painted by Arthur himself in gold letters, lay cracked in a pawn shop basement somewhere. Ellie stared at the letters again. Her lips moved, but no words came out. The silence felt alive, breathing down her neck. Somewhere deep inside, the question rose that every desperate heart asks when life's math stops adding up. Where is God now? The narrator's tone would soften here, almost like a whisper in a dark theater. $50,000 in debt, alone, forgotten. And yet, she didn't know it. But in less than 24 hours, something would happen that would change everything. Not through banks, not through luck, but through an answer she had stopped believing could ever come. Cut to black. A slow fade-in of the morning light glinting off the metal of her singer machine. The hum of the city rises. The voice returns, steady, inviting, mysterious. When a woman prays from the bottom of despair, does heaven still hear her? Stay with us, because what happened to Ellie Martinez will make you rethink what a miracle really looks like. The image lingers on the eviction letter, the number $50,000 bold and unforgiving. Then, a gust of wind from the half-open window flips the paper, revealing beneath it a small, faded photo. Ellie and Arthur on their wedding day, smiling, holding hands in front of the old church. The shot holds for a moment too long, long enough for viewers to feel the weight of everything she's lost, and then fades out with a whisper of a sewing machine starting to hum again. A faint voiceover closes the hook. This is not a story about money. It's about faith, tested, broken, and reborn. And it all began with $50,000 and a prayer whispered to Jesus Christ. Long before the eviction letters and sleepless nights, Ellie and Arthur Martinez had built their lives one stitch at a time. Their love story didn't begin in wealth. It began in a small, sunlit garage behind their first rented house in San Antonio, where the hum of an old sewing machine became the rhythm of their marriage. Arthur was an electrician. Steady hands, quiet humor, the kind of man who could fix anything except his wife's stubborn habit of overworking. Ellie was already known in their neighborhood for her craft. She didn't just sew dresses. She listened to people's stories and turned them into fabric and form. When she designed a wedding gown, she asked about the proposal, the music, the flowers. Every stitch should mean something, she used to say. Together they opened Ellie's Stitches, a narrow storefront tucked between a bakery and a florist on Commerce Street. The shop became a local landmark. Brides came from across Texas for her handmade lace. Mothers brought their daughters for custom quinceañera gowns. On Saturday mornings, laughter and gospel music spilled from the open windows. Arthur would hand out sweet tea while Ellie measured fabrics with precision that felt like magic. They weren't rich, but they were respected, loved, needed. Then came the diagnosis. It started as a cough, just a stubborn cough Arthur refused to check. "It's nothing," he'd said, waving her off. But by the time they reached the hospital, the scans told another story. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctor's voice was calm but heavy, as if he had repeated those words too many times. Ellie remembered the moment the doctor said, "No cure," like the snap of a thread. The world went silent. Only the hum of the fluorescent lights remained. Arthur, ever the optimist, squeezed her hand. "We'll fight it, mi amor," he said. "We'll find a way." They tried everything. Local treatments, specialists in Houston, even experimental therapy at a private clinic. Each visit meant new bills. Each prescription meant another payment plan. Ellie sold her jewelry, her car, even the antique Singer machine her mother had left her. When those weren't enough, she mortgaged the shop. Neighbors offered sympathy, but sympathy doesn't pay hospital bills. The camera might cut here to Ellie sitting beside Arthur in a sterile hospital room, sewing a small handkerchief as he slept. Each movement of the needle was slow, deliberate, her way of holding the world together while it quietly came apart. The months blurred into one another. Arthur's body grew frail, his laughter rare. He apologized often for being a burden. She always answered, "You are the reason I breathe." When he passed, it was just before dawn. The nurses said he went peacefully. Ellie knew better. There is no peaceful way to lose half of your soul. After the funeral, the debts began arriving like clockwork. Bills from Houston, collectors from credit offices, the final mortgage notices. Grief gave her no space to rest. She returned to the shop, hoping work would silence the pain. But without Arthur's steady hand in the books, the numbers never added up. Orders slowed. The pandemic closed the city. One by one, her employees left for other jobs. Soon, Ellie's Stitches was just Ellie again. Alone, sewing until midnight to pay interest on interest. She refused to tell her daughter Sophia how bad things were. "She has her own family," Ellie would whisper. "She doesn't need to carry mine too." But the truth was simple. Love had cost them everything. Savings, home, and even the business that once symbolized their success. As months turned to years, the sign above the shop faded under the Texas sun until only one word remained visible: Stitches. The rest, Ellie's name, Arthur's dream, had already begun to disappear. By the time the second mortgage fell through, Ellie Martinez had already sold nearly everything that could be sold. The last sewing machine stood in the corner like a loyal friend waiting for orders that would never come. That was when he arrived. Randall Scott. He came dressed like trust itself. Navy suit, silk tie, polished shoes that gleamed even under the dust of Southtown. His voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who'd told 1,000 desperate people that everything would be all right. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, sliding a folder across the table, "I represent a private fund that helps small business owners in medical crisis. No banks, no judgment, just people helping people." To a woman drowning in bills, those words sounded like oxygen. Randall spoke softly, almost pastor-like. He praised her craftsmanship, the beauty of her embroidered roses, the decades she had given to her community. "People like you," he said, "you deserve a break." The deal looked simple: a $50,000 bridge loan, low monthly payments, and humanitarian interest rates. He even promised to waive the first month's fees. He knew exactly when to lower his voice, exactly when to smile. And when Ellie hesitated, he leaned forward and whispered, "Do it for your husband." It's what he would have wanted. The papers were thick with fine print. Ellie didn't read them all. Her eyes tired too easily these days, and she wanted to believe in something good again. She signed. For the next few weeks, life almost felt manageable. The clinic bills stopped calling. She caught up on rent. She bought new thread and fabric, telling herself maybe she could restart the business part-time. But then the phone started ringing again. At first it was polite reminders. Then came the threats. "Your payment's late, Mrs. Martinez. But the due date's next week." "Not anymore. Check the updated clause, page 4, section 3. Each call grew sharper, colder, more mechanical. The friendly fun Randall promised had turned into a pack of collectors that called morning, noon, and night. And when she missed one payment, just one, the penalties began to multiply like rot. Within 6 months, her $50,000 debt had swollen past $80,000. The interest wasn't humanitarian, it was predatory, and Randall Scott had vanished behind new phone numbers, new office addresses, new lies. One humid afternoon, the knock came at her door. Not the light knock of a neighbor, a heavy, deliberate pounding that made her chest tighten. When she opened it, Randall stood there again, but this time he wasn't smiling. 2 large men flanked him, silent, expressionless. "Mrs. Martinez," he began, voice stripped of all charm, "we need to talk about repayment." She tried to explain. Sales were slow, clients hadn't returned. She just needed a few more months. Randall interrupted her with a hand gesture, the way one swats away a fly. "Business is business," he said calmly. "Either we collect the debt or we collect the property." Her property was her shop, her life. He offered a solution: sell the building to his associate for a fraction of its worth, and her record would stay clean. She understood then. It had never been about helping her. It had always been about taking what little she had left. That night, Ellie walked through Ellie's stitches one last time. The lights flickered, revealing empty racks where gowns once hung. She touched the countertop where Arthur used to sort invoices, the walls that still smelled faintly of fabric softener and coffee. Then she took down the golden sign with trembling hands. The next morning, Randall Scott returned with his men. She placed the keys in his palm. "I hope this buys my peace," she said quietly. He smirked, pocketed the keys, and replied, "Peace is expensive, Mrs. Martinez. You just rented yours for a month." As he walked away, the door shut behind him with the hollow sound of finality, the sound of the wolf fed and the home emptied. When the glass door of Ellie's stitches closed for the last time, the sound was small, almost gentle, yet it carried the weight of half a century. The street outside still buzzed with life: a food truck horn, a child laughing, a bus sighing at the corner. But inside, silence had moved in to stay. The countertop, once covered in sketches and ribbons, now stood bare except for a single set of keys. Ellie placed them down carefully, as if afraid to wake something sleeping beneath the surface. The shop had been her cathedral, her holy place of creation. Every inch of that room had known laughter, music, and the quiet joy of women trying on dreams. Now it smelled like dust and goodbye. Randall Scott's men were waiting outside, engines idling. She could hear the low rumble through the glass. There was no shouting, no fight left to give. She signed the papers with a hand that barely held steady, the pen wobbling like the needle of an exhausted compass. "Take care of the place," she said softly, though she knew they wouldn't. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, the Texas sun hit her face. It should have felt warm, but it burned instead. Her reflection in the shop window looked foreign, smaller somehow, like the years had collapsed inward. The golden sign Arthur once painted was gone, sold for scrap. Only the faint outline of her name remained in the dust on the glass. E.L.L., faded halfway through. That night she carried a single suitcase back to her apartment, a few dresses, her Bible, and her mother's old Singer machine. It was all she had left that couldn't be repossessed. The new apartment on Culebra Road was barely 400 square feet. The walls smelled of mildew, and the refrigerator wheezed louder than it cooled. But what hurt most wasn't the poverty, it was the quiet. In the shop, she'd always had voices around her: laughter, gossip, music. Here, there was only the hum of the streetlight outside and the echo of her own thoughts. Sometimes at night, she would catch herself glancing at the door, expecting Arthur to walk in, dust on his boots, teasing her for working too late. But he was gone. So were the women who used to call her La Maestra. So was the purpose that had carried her through every storm. She tried to keep her hands busy, hemming a skirt for a neighbor, patching old jeans, but her joints stiffened from arthritis and her eyes blurred after an hour under the yellow bulb. The pay barely covered groceries. Still, she told no one. Not her daughter Sophia in Houston, not her friends from church who hadn't seen her since the funeral. Pride can be cruel that way. It disguises itself as dignity until you realize it's just fear of pity. The debt collectors didn't care about dignity. They called daily, their voices polished but merciless. "Mrs. Martinez, your balance is overdue." She'd hang up before they finished. Sometimes she'd cry after. Sometimes she'd just stare at the ceiling, numb. When the power was finally cut off, Ellie sat in the dark and listened to the ticking of a wall clock that no longer told time right. The air was thick with summer heat, the kind that makes walls sweat. She lit a candle and placed it beside the sewing machine, its golden thread glinting faintly in the flame. For the first time in her life, she wondered if hard work had been a lie. If all those years of believing in effort, in faith, in doing the right thing, had been some elaborate illusion. In the silence, the camera might close in on her face, wrinkled, illuminated by candlelight, eyes hollow but searching. Then down to the keys on the empty counter, still glinting faintly in memory. It wasn't just a shop she'd lost. It was her anchor. And now, drifting without direction, Ellie Martinez had finally reached the bottom, where even prayer felt too heavy to lift. In the weeks after losing her shop, Ellie Martinez learned something she'd never expected, that in America there are doors that don't open for the elderly, no matter how hard they knock. The first one slammed at a downtown clothing factory. The manager, a young woman with a tablet in her hands and impatience in her eyes, flipped through Ellie's resume like it was a relic from another century. 73, she said, forcing a polite smile. "We really admire your experience, ma'am, but the work is fast-paced." Ellie nodded, pretending not to hear the rest. Too old, too slow, too fragile. The second rejection came from a tailor shop on Commerce Street, the same street where her own boutique once stood. The owner, barely 30, shook her head before Ellie had even finished her sentence. "We use digital embroidery now," she said. "You probably wouldn't be comfortable with that technology." The word you carried pity wrapped in condescension. Each no cut deeper than the last. Every time she walked back to her apartment, the city looked larger, louder, more indifferent. The same sidewalks that had once carried her toward opportunity now seemed to push her away. Her hands, once prized for their precision, trembled with arthritis when she tried to thread a needle. Her eyesight, once sharp enough to see imperfections in silk, blurred under the dim bulb of her kitchen. "I still have skill," she would whisper to herself. "I still have worth." But no one seemed to believe it. Not employers, not the government, not even her own reflection. The bills stacked up again. Without Arthur's pension, lost to hospital debts, and no steady income, Ellie lived on black coffee and whatever canned goods were on sale at the corner store. The refrigerator rattled each night like a broken heart. The debt collectors were relentless. Sometimes they called under new company names, pretending to offer forgiveness programs that led to the same dead end. One voice, a man with an accent too cheerful to be real, once told her, "At your age, ma'am, why not let it go? No one expects you to pay it back anyway." She hung up before he could finish. In the neighborhood, people saw her but didn't see her. She became part of the background, just another old woman walking slowly down Culebra Road with a grocery bag that looked heavier than it was. The shopkeepers smiled out of habit but didn't meet her eyes. The world moved too fast to notice the ones it left behind. Once on a rainy afternoon, Ellie sat on a bus beside a group of high school girls laughing over TikToks. One of them filmed her reflection in the window and whispered, "She looks like a ghost." The others giggled. Ellie pretended not to hear. She used to design the kind of dresses those girls dreamed of wearing. Now she was a punchline in their scroll. At night, she would sit by the window, watching the neon lights of the laundromat across the street flicker on and off. Inside, people came and went. Families, workers, couples, everyone with somewhere to be. Ellie hadn't felt that sense of belonging in a long time. Some nights she prayed. Other nights, she just stared at her sewing machine, wondering if faith was another kind of labor that life no longer paid for. And yet, even in her invisibility, there was defiance. She still woke before dawn, brushed her hair, made her bed, and brewed a cup of coffee as if she had somewhere important to go. Because deep down, a voice she could barely recognize still whispered that miracles don't come to those who quit early. But as the days passed and each door stayed shut, that whisper grew fainter, like a radio signal losing range, until Ellie feared that even heaven had stopped listening. The night the letter of eviction arrived, the rain refused to stop. It drummed against the windows like impatient fingers, blurring the city lights of San Antonio into streaks of amber and gray. Ellie Martinez sat by the window, the folded letter trembling in her lap. 30 days. That's all the landlord was giving her to pay or leave. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but no more tears would come. Grief had dried them out. The candle beside her guttered, its flame fighting the damp air. Outside, thunder rolled, distant yet near enough to shake the glass. Across the narrow street, through the rain-speckled window, Ellie noticed something she hadn't seen before. In the apartment opposite hers, a young woman sat at a sewing machine. The hum was faint, barely audible through the storm, but Ellie could feel it more than hear it. That familiar rhythm, steady, precise, alive. The girl couldn't have been more than 25, her hair tied back, her head bent in deep concentration as she guided fabric beneath the needle. A small lamp cast a golden halo around her, painting the scene like a memory. Ellie leaned closer, her breath fogging the glass. For a moment she was no longer 73. She was 20 again, working late in her first apartment, determined to prove that hard work could rewrite destiny. She remembered Arthur laughing, telling her to sleep, and her answering, "Dreams don't stitch themselves." Now she watched her younger self across the street. Only this time it wasn't a dream. It was a stranger, perhaps a single mother or a student trying to make rent, chasing the same invisible hope Ellie once chased. Something stirred inside her chest. Pain at first, then something else. Recognition. The storm outside grew louder. Cars splashed through puddles, thunder cracked, and yet that small light across the street stayed steady. Every motion of the young woman's hands seemed like defiance. Against fatigue, against despair, against the world that tells women when they've reached their expiration date. Ellie pressed her palm to the cold glass. The reflection of her own face overlapped with the girl's silhouette, as if the past and present had finally found each other. Wrinkles, gray hair, arthritic fingers, all of it dissolved into a single truth. She was still the same woman who once fought for beauty amid hardship. The camera might linger here. Two windows, two women, two eras mirroring one another through sheets of rain. Ellie whispered to no one, "Keep sewing, sweetheart. Don't stop." The words echoed softly in the empty room. For the first time in months, she didn't feel completely alone. The sight of that stranger working through the night was like a message from heaven, subtle but undeniable. When the girl turned off her lamp around 2 a.m., Ellie stayed by the window long after. The rain now gentle, the city asleep. Somewhere in that silence, a decision began to take root, not loud or dramatic, but quiet, like the first stitch in a long seam. She rose, folded the eviction notice, and placed it beneath her worn Bible. Tomorrow she decided she would go out, not to beg, but to walk, to see, to think, maybe even to pray again. The dawn came slow and pale, seeping through the blinds like mercy. Ellie brewed a small cup of coffee, dressed in her best blouse, the one Arthur always said made her look like Sunday morning. As she opened her door to step outside, the narrator's voice might whisper over the scene. Sometimes God doesn't speak in thunder or miracles. Sometimes he just turns on a light across the street to remind you that hope still works the night shift. And somewhere across the city, the hum of a sewing machine began again. Soft, steady, and holy. Sunday morning rose quiet over San Antonio, the kind of morning that carried both peace and sorrow in equal measure. The storm had passed, but puddles still shimmered in the cracks of the street. Ellie Martinez, dressed in her best beige dress and a faded blue shawl, walked slowly towards St. Jude's Catholic Church, a place she hadn't visited since Arthur's funeral. The city was still half asleep. Storefronts remained shuttered, and the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt and bakery bread from down the block. Each step to the church felt heavier than the last, as if she were walking not toward sanctuary, but toward an admission, an acknowledgement that she couldn't fix her life alone anymore. Inside, the church was mostly empty. The first mass wouldn't start for another hour. A handful of candles flickered near the altar, their flames bending slightly in the draft. A young man knelt near the front, his head bowed. An elderly woman arranged flowers near a statue of the Virgin Mary. Ellie walked down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing against the marble. Before her stood a large crucifix, Jesus Christ suspended in silent compassion, his head bowed, his eyes carved to look as though they saw everything and judged nothing. For a long time, she just stood there. The silence pressed around her like water. Then, without planning it, she sank to her knees. The sound of her old bones meeting the cold marble startled even her. She folded her hands, fingers trembling, lips parting to speak words she hadn't said in years. "Lord Jesus Christ," her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. "I don't even know what to ask for anymore." The camera might circle her slowly here. The image of a woman kneeling under shafts of colored light filtering through stained glass. Every color reflected on her wrinkled face like fragments of forgotten hope. "I've tried everything I knew," she continued, her words breaking apart between breaths. "Hard work, faith, patience, but I've lost it all. The shop, the home, Arthur." A tear slipped down her cheek. "Maybe I even lost you somewhere along the way." From a pew behind her, a soft cough echoed. A janitor was mopping the far corner, pretending not to listen. But Ellie didn't stop. Her voice, though quiet, carried through the hollow space like a confession meant for everyone and no one. "If I'm being punished," she said, "then I accept it. Maybe I was too proud to ask for help. Maybe I thought I didn't need you, but I do. I do now more than ever." Her hands gripped the edge of the bench before her. "I'm not asking for riches, Lord. Just a chance, a door to open, a sign that you still see me, because right now I feel invisible." Her words hung in the air for a long moment. Then, somewhere deep in the church, the candles flickered in unison, as if stirred by an unseen wind. To anyone else, it was coincidence, a draft through an old building. But Ellie's heart recognized something else: presence. Her tears came freely now, not of despair, but release. For the first time in years, she wasn't fighting. She was surrendering. She reached into her purse and took out her rosary, its beads worn smooth from years of neglect. One by one, she prayed through them. The Hail Mary, the Our Father, the prayer to St. Jude, the patron of hopeless causes. The sunlight shifted, casting a golden glow over the crucifix. The face of Jesus seemed softer somehow, almost alive. And though no voice spoke aloud, Ellie felt the message as clearly as if whispered beside her ear. "You are not alone." When she finally rose, her knees ached, but her heart was strangely light. The world outside hadn't changed. Her debts still waited, her landlord still expected payment. But she walked out of St. Jude's different. The camera would follow her down the church steps, wine brushing her gray hair, her shawl fluttering like a small flag of faith reclaimed. Narration, low and steady. Sometimes the miracle doesn't start with money or healing. It starts with surrender, when a broken heart dares to whisper again, "Lord Jesus Christ, I still believe." Monday morning arrived gray and quiet, the kind of morning that pretends to be ordinary while heaven prepares a surprise. Ellie Martinez woke before sunrise, as she always had, but something about the air felt lighter. The anxiety that usually gripped her chest was still there, but softer, like a bruise fading instead of bleeding. She made herself a small cup of coffee using the last spoonful of instant mix left in the jar. The aroma filled the apartment, blending with the faint smell of rain-soaked concrete that drifted through the half-open window. For a moment, she just sat and watched the city wake. Delivery trucks rumbled by, a stray dog barked in the alley, and across the street, the same young woman from the night before started her sewing machine again. Ellie smiled faintly. Something about that sound, the rhythmic hum of determination, gave her a reason to stand up, to keep breathing. At 9:47 a.m., The old landline phone rang. The noise startled her. For months, the only calls had been from collectors or scammers. She nearly didn't answer, but something inside whispered, "Pick it up." "Mrs. Martinez," a young female voice asked. "My name is Madison Lee. I'm a producer for Heart of Texas, a local segment on KTXS News." Ellie's brow furrowed. "I think you have the wrong number," she said softly. "I'm not anyone worth putting on television." Madison chuckled gently. "I'm sure that's not true. One of our community partners, the local parish at St. Jude, sent us your name. They said you were one of San Antonio's most talented seamstresses and that you lost your business during the pandemic. We're doing a story about small artisans who've been displaced. We'd love to feature you." The words barely made sense. Ellie blinked, gripping the receiver like a fragile bird. "Feature me?" she repeated. "On the news?" "Yes, ma'am," Madison said, her voice warm but professional. "We'd like to hear your story, what you've built, what you've overcome. Would you be open to an interview? Maybe this afternoon?" Ellie looked around her apartment. The peeling paint, the cluttered table, the single chair by the window. Shame flushed her cheeks. "I don't really have much to show anymore," she said. "I don't even have a proper workspace." Madison's tone softened further. "Mrs. Martinez, people don't need perfection. They need stories that remind them who they are. Yours might be exactly that." A long pause followed. Ellie could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. For months she had begged for a sign, for some acknowledgement that heaven still saw her. Could this call be that sign? Or was it just another misunderstanding? Another cruel joke by life? "All right," she finally said, "but I can't promise it will be interesting." "Oh, I have a feeling it will be," Madison replied. "We'll stop by around 3 with a cameraman. Thank you, Mrs. Martinez. And thank you for saying yes." When the line clicked, Ellie sat perfectly still for several seconds. Then, without realizing it, she laughed. A small, broken sound that turned into something lighter. She looked up toward the crucifix hanging above the door. "Is this you again, Lord Jesus Christ?" she whispered. "Are you really doing this?" The hours that followed were a blur of nervous energy. She cleaned her apartment as if preparing for royalty, dusting the windowsill, polishing the coffee table with an old towel, straightening the worn curtains. She set her singer machine on the table by the window, placing a few spools of colorful thread beside it, like old soldiers ready for one more battle. Then she found a small box of photographs, Arthur holding up her first wedding gown design, a young bride crying tears of joy, a newspaper clipping that once called her the Needle of San Antonio. She spread them out neatly, evidence of a life that had once mattered. At exactly 3 o'clock, a soft knock echoed at the door. When she opened it, Madison Lee stood there, mid-30s, neat blazer, kind eyes, and behind her a cameraman adjusting his lens. "Mrs. Martinez," Madison smiled. "Thank you for letting us in." Ellie stepped aside, her heart racing. For the first time in years, her apartment was full of light, conversation, and possibility. The narrator's voice might fade in here, gentle but certain. Sometimes when we think heaven is silent, it's only waiting for the right moment to dial our number. And when the call finally comes, it sounds a lot like grace. The knock on the door came exactly at 3. When Ellie Martinez opened it, sunlight spilled in behind the two visitors as if they were bringing the day itself into her dim apartment. Madison Lee, producer of Heart of Texas, smiled warmly, balancing a clipboard under one arm. Behind her stood a cameraman with kind eyes and a shoulder rig already humming to life. "Thank you for letting us visit, Mrs. Martinez," Madison said. "We promise not to take too much of your time." "Please," Ellie replied nervously, brushing invisible dust off her old dress. "Time's the only thing I have plenty of." They sat up by the window, where the light hit just right. Ellie had cleaned every corner, though her home still carried the air of modest survival. Thin curtains, cracked walls, a table scarred from years of work. But at the center of it all sat her singer machine, gleaming like a relic from another era. Madison glanced at it and smiled. "Is that the same machine you used in your shop?" Ellie nodded. "Since 1975. It belonged to my mother before me." The cameraman knelt to capture a close-up, zooming in on the silver foot pedal, the worn markings on the edge, the spool of golden thread. Madison began with gentle questions. How did she start sewing? What was her favorite piece? What did Ellie's stitches mean to her? At first, Ellie answered carefully, her voice small, almost apologetic. But as the memories resurfaced, her tone grew stronger. She spoke of brides who'd cried in her fitting room, of quinceañeras who twirled in front of mirrors like princesses, of Arthur painting the shop sign in their backyard. The camera caught it all, the glimmer in her eyes, the faint smile she tried to hide. When the questions paused, Madison said softly, "Would you mind showing us how you work? Maybe a little demonstration?" Ellie hesitated. Her fingers weren't what they used to be. The arthritis made them stiff in the mornings, uncooperative in the cold. But something about Madison's genuine curiosity gave her courage. "I'll try," she said, sitting at the table. The moment her foot pressed the pedal, the singer came alive with a low, familiar hum, the sound of a lifetime rediscovered. Her hands, trembling seconds ago, steadied as they guided the fabric beneath the needle. The rhythm returned effortlessly. Forward, pivot, stitch, breathe. The camera zoomed in, catching every motion, every detail, the veins under her skin, the precision of each line, the quiet mastery of someone who had lived inside this craft. Madison whispered almost to herself, "It's beautiful, like watching music." Ellie smiled without looking up. "My husband used to say the same thing." She chose to embroider a rose, a symbol she had sewn countless times before. Each petal bloomed in thread, red deepening into crimson, then gold at the edges. Her movements were slow but certain, the way a pianist might touch a familiar melody after years away from the stage. The apartment changed in that moment. The air felt warmer, alive. The camera's mechanical whir faded beneath the steady rhythm of the needle. When she finished, Ellie lifted the small square of fabric to the light. The rose gleamed. Perfect. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then Madison set down her clipboard and said quietly, "Mrs. Martinez, you realize this isn't just sewing, right? This is art. It's heritage. It's faith made visible." Ellie blinked, her eyes welling up. "I just did what my hands remembered." "That," Madison said, "is exactly what the world needs to remember too." They filmed a few more shots, Ellie holding the rose, the light catching her silver hair, her laughter returning in soft ripples. When they finally packed up, Madison touched her shoulder gently. "I don't know what will come of this, but something tells me this story isn't done yet." After they left, the apartment felt quiet again, but not empty. The rose sat drying on the table, glowing under the last rays of Texas sunlight. Ellie looked at her hands, no longer ashamed of their tremor. "You still got it, old girl," she murmured. Then she glanced up at the small crucifix above her door. "Thank you," she whispered. "I see what you're doing." The narrator's voice would close softly. "When God restores what's broken, he often begins with the hands, because they still remember what the heart has forgotten." For 2 days after the interview, Ellie Martinez waited without expectation. She told herself not to hope. Heart of Texas was probably just another feel-good segment that would air once and disappear among the noise of morning television. Still, she found herself glancing at the phone more often, her heart jumping at every unknown number that appeared on the screen. On the third morning, the call came. "Mrs. Martinez." The voice on the line was familiar, Madison Lee. But this time, her tone carried a hint of excitement. "I just wanted you to know your story aired last night. And, well, something unexpected happened." Ellie held her breath. "The response was incredible," Madison continued. "We've had hundreds of messages asking how to contact you. And there's someone else who wants to meet, someone from Macy's corporate office in Dallas. They're launching a pilot program called American Heritage, promoting handcrafted artisan goods made in the U.S. They think your embroidery could headline the collection." Ellie's voice wavered. "Macy's? The department store?" "Yes," Madison said, smiling through the phone. "They want to talk today. Would you be open to a meeting?" The room seemed to spin. For months, Ellie had been invisible, forgotten, unneeded. Now, out of nowhere, a door she never could have knocked on herself was opening. 3 hours later, she sat in front of her laptop, an old sputtering device Madison had helped her set up on Zoom. On the other side of the screen appeared two executives in crisp suits, framed by a sleek Macy's boardroom. Anna Thompson, director of Heritage Brands, led the conversation. "Mrs. Martinez," she began warmly, "we were deeply moved by your story. Your craftsmanship represents everything American heritage stands for: authenticity, endurance, and faith in work. We'd like to offer you a contract to design a limited run of embroidered pieces under your name." Ellie blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "My name?" "Yes. The collection would be called Ellie's Roses." Behind her, the sewing machine caught the light from the window, almost glowing. Her throat tightened. I don't have a shop anymore. Just this apartment." Anna smiled. "We'll provide a small workspace in San Antonio. Materials, machines, even a team. You'll oversee designs and training. It's part of our new initiative to revive traditional craftsmanship in local communities." A man seated beside Anna added, "It's a 6-month pilot, starting with 200 pieces, table runners, blouses, and mantles. We're offering an advance of $75,000. Ellie gasped. The camera shook slightly as her hand covered her mouth. Tears welled up, too fast to stop. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't mean to cry." Anna's expression softened. "Don't be sorry, Mrs. Martinez. It's not every day Providence works through morning television." The meeting ended with promises of follow-up paperwork and a courier to deliver the contract in person. When the screen went black, Ellie sat still, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The camera would linger on her face, aged, tear-streaked, illuminated by sunlight, before panning down to the fabric on the table. There, the embroidered rose from her interview glowed beneath the light like something sacred. "Arthur," she murmured, eyes lifting toward the crucifix above the doorway. "You were right. Hard work does pay off, just not always in the way we expect." Later that afternoon, Madison stopped by, carrying coffee and the printed contract. They reviewed each page together, and when Ellie signed her name at the bottom, her hand trembled, not from weakness, but from awe. Madison looked around the apartment one last time, then smiled. "You won't be sewing here much longer. We've already found you a workshop downtown. Light, spacious, full of promise." Ellie's laughter came softly, between disbelief and prayer. "It feels like he was waiting for me to say yes first," she said. The narrator's voice would rise gently over the image of the signed contract and the old singer gleaming in the corner. "When faith and craftsmanship meet, heaven doesn't need to shout. Sometimes it simply whispers through open doors and calls it Providence." The new workspace sat on the corner of South Flores and Gwenter, a narrow brick building with high windows that poured sunlight over every surface. To most people, it looked like an ordinary studio. But to Ellie Martinez, it was resurrection ground. The first day she walked through those glass doors, her hands trembled, not from age, but from awe. Everything gleamed, new sewing machines lined neatly in rows, bolts of fabric stacked like rainbows, drawers filled with spools of thread. In one corner stood a small table with a golden plaque that read, "Ellie's Roses, Master Artisan." Madison was there to greet her. "Feels like a second home, doesn't it?" Ellie ran her fingers along the edge of the nearest table, smiling. "Feels like a miracle I can touch." Within a week, she received her first 2 hires. Alejandra, a 25-year-old single mother recently laid off from a factory, and Carmen, a 58-year-old seamstress who hadn't found steady work in 3 years. The 3 women worked side by side, the rhythm of their machines blending into a gentle chorus of hope. At first, Ellie feared she wouldn't be able to lead again. Her body tired faster now, and the thought of responsibility scared her. But the younger women looked to her for guidance, their faces lighting up whenever she adjusted a stitch or corrected a pattern. In their eyes, she wasn't an old woman. She was the teacher, the maestra. Each morning began the same way. Ellie would open the studio early, light a small candle under the crucifix Madison had hung by the window, and whisper, "Thank you, Lord Jesus Christ, for another day to work." Then the women would arrive, coffee cups in hand, ready to sew their way back into dignity. By the end of the first month, they had finished the initial prototypes for Macy's American Heritage Collection. Hand-embroidered table runners, blouses, and napkins, each piece signed with a small stitched rose in the corner. Ellie insisted on quality over quantity. "Every thread carries someone's story," she would say. "Make it worthy of their home." When the shipment went out, she prayed over each box before sealing it with tape. "Go bless someone," she whispered. Weeks later, the results stunned everyone. The first batch of products sold out in 3 weeks. Macy's called it a surprising breakout success, and the company doubled its order immediately. For the first time in years, Ellie's bank account wasn't red. It was breathing again. But money wasn't the real miracle. It was the community that formed inside those four walls. Word spread quickly through San Antonio's South Side. Women began showing up at the studio, widows, mothers, retirees, asking if there was room for them too. Some hadn't sewn in decades. Others were experts who'd lost their jobs to automation. Ellie found ways to include them all. "Everyone deserves a second stitch," she said with a grin. By summer, the team had grown to 12 women, each with a story stitched into their work. Alejandra saved enough to put her son in preschool. Carmen began teaching embroidery to her church group. A grandmother named Lupe embroidered scripture verses into leftover scraps and gave them to homeless shelters. Ellie watched it all unfold like a garden she hadn't realized she'd planted. She'd come to believe that her hands had aged past usefulness, yet here they were, multiplying through others. When Heart of Texas returned to film a follow-up piece, the cameras captured something new. Not a tired widow scraping by, but a leader surrounded by life. The footage showed the women laughing as they worked, the hum of machines blending with gospel music, sunlight spilling over tables of color. One scene stood out. Ellie guiding a teenage intern's hand on the fabric, whispering, "Gentle, not afraid." The thread listens to your heart. The narrator might describe it this way. What began as a story about loss had become a movement of renewal, proof that when faith rebuilds a life, it never stops at one. 6 months later, the Ellie's Roses collection was featured in Macy's stores across Texas. Customers sent letters praising not only the beauty of the products, but the spirit they carried, handmade hope. On a quiet Friday evening, after the workers had gone home, Ellie stood alone in the studio. The sunset poured gold across the room, turning every thread into a line of light. She looked around at the empty chairs, at the tools waiting for Monday's bustle, and whispered with tears in her eyes, "From one pair of hands, Lord, you made 12. She touched the embroidered rose framed on the wall, the same one she'd sewn during that first interview, and smiled. "When God rebuilds what's broken," the closing narration would say, "He rarely stops at the walls. He multiplies the hands that once trembled, until they become a chorus of grace." A year later, St. Jude's Catholic Church was filled to the last pew. The air shimmered with candlelight, the scent of lilies and warm wax rising like a hymn. It was the same church where Ellie Martinez had once knelt alone, whispering a prayer through tears, asking Jesus Christ for a sign that she wasn't forgotten. Now she stood at the front beneath that same crucifix, holding a small square of embroidered silk wrapped in gold thread. The congregation had come to hear her speak after seeing her story spread across Texas. The 73-year-old seamstress whose prayers turned into a business that changed dozens of lives. The priest, Father Miguel, adjusted the microphone and smiled. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, "would you like to share your testimony?" Ellie nodded, her silver hair catching the light as she stepped forward. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied with every word. "A year ago," she began, "I came into this church believing my life was over. My husband was gone. My business was gone. I owed $50,000 I couldn't pay. I thought God had stopped hearing me." The audience leaned forward, women wiping tears, men folding their hands, children whispering to their mothers. "I remember kneeling right there," she continued, pointing to the first pew. "I didn't ask for riches. I didn't ask for comfort. I just said, 'Lord Jesus Christ, please, show me that you still see me.'" And less than a day later, the phone rang. A murmur rippled through the crowd, people remembering the broadcast, the miracle that began with a local news story. That call brought Madison from Heart of Texas into my home, and through her, God opened a door I didn't even know existed, a partnership with Macy's that became Ellie's Roses. But let me tell you something. She paused, letting her words breathe. The miracle wasn't the money. It wasn't the fame. It was the people. Her eyes drifted over the pews where her 12 seamstresses sat together, Alejandra with her son asleep on her lap, Carmen holding a rosary between her fingers, Lupe smiling proudly. These women, Ellie said, voice rising, were once where I was, forgotten, invisible, waiting for something to change. But through that door God opened for me. They found their own. From one pair of hands, he made many. The camera might pan across the congregation, a quiet awe falling over the room, as if everyone could feel the pulse of faith made visible. Ellie unwrapped the silk square she'd been holding. On it was an embroidered image of St. Jude, glowing under the candlelight, his robe stitched in shimmering gold and emerald thread. This, she said softly, is the first piece I made after the miracle. I keep it to remind myself that God doesn't forget our names, even when the world does. She lifted the cloth high. If you're struggling right now, if you're buried in debt or grief or shame, please don't give up. Pray. Ask him for help. And when he opens the door, even just a crack, walk through it, because miracles don't always fall from the sky. Sometimes they arrive as a phone call, or a stranger's kindness, or the quiet hum of a sewing machine. The church stood silent for a long heartbeat. Then applause broke out, first a few hands, then the entire room. Some were crying openly. Others bowed their heads, whispering prayers of their own. After the service, people lined up to meet her, women pressing her hands, men thanking her for reminding them that faith wasn't just a Sunday thing. Madison recorded every moment, her camera capturing the image of Ellie surrounded by the very community that once pitied her, now inspired by her. Outside, as the sun dipped behind the bell tower, Ellie walked down the church steps, pausing to look at the sky. She smiled quietly. "You really never stopped listening, did you?" she whispered to Jesus Christ. "Thank you for the quiet miracle." The narrator's voice would close over the image of the church doors glowing in the twilight. Her story began with loss but ended with legacy. From one prayer came a movement. From one broken heart came 100 healed. And in every stitch of Ellie's roses, the hands of a 73-year-old woman still whisper the same truth, that God never forgets his own. If Ellie's story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Stories of Grace for more real stories of faith, redemption, and the quiet miracles that still happen every day. Because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us that Jesus Christ is still working, one life at a time.